Jesus gives us a commandment coming from the Old Testament. Love God with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your strength. And he gives us a second one like it, to love our neighbor as ourselves. Now, we know these quite well. In fact, they really are a summary of the entire message of the gospel in its most succinct and simplest form. In our second reading today from St. Paul to the Philippians, we see that this brotherly or neighborly love is stressed to be an imitation of the love that Christ had for all of us and for the church, his bride. St. Paul tells us to find solace in love, in compassion, in mercy, united with the heart of Christ, to love as he loved. Not selfishly or out of vanity or narcissistically, but rather out of humility, loving others more than yourself, looking out for their interest more than your own. Now, this kind of love is hard. But love, by definition, is about the other and not about what we receive in return. Loving another is about the gift and not about that which is come back to us, which is why St. Paul reminds us about the cross. There is nothing about the cross that gains anything for the giver, for Christ. It doesn't make him a better God, a holier God, a more loving God. The cross and his death is all for and about us. It's so easy to love someone and to think, what am I going to get out of this? Whether it be in a relationship or as we are called to love our neighbors, even those strangers we don't know. Will I get recognition, or will someone notice me if I help the poor? Will I get a plaque or an award? Real, true love doesn't care about these things. Again, like the cross. Jesus died for everyone, but he knew that some of us would reject him and reject this gift of his love. Jesus tries today to show the chief priests and the elders of the people that the hardness of their own hearts and their own selfishness was to their detriment. He uses this parable of the two sons and the father. The one son who rejects the command of the father, but later reconsiders, while the other son agrees to work, but fails to follow through with the promise that he made. Jesus asks him, which of these two sons is more righteous? Who did the father's will? They answer, as we heard, the first son, who rejected but later changed his mind and completed the work. And Christ uses this analogy to point out that they, the chief priests and the elders, have rejected the message of the prophets, and specifically John the Baptist. And now they're rejecting Christ himself, God, the Word made flesh, right in their midst. And are still unwilling to change their hearts to do the Father's will, even though they claim to be holy men. Meanwhile, people who had formerly rejected God's law, tax collectors, the greatest thieves of the empire, prostitutes, and other sinners who have turned away from God in the past, are now turning away from their hard-heartedness and are now following God's will. Which, as we heard in our first reading from Ezekiel, that those who turn away from their wickedness and do what is right and just, turning to virtue, they will be preserved. They will surely live and not die. So Ezekiel brings us to another point to consider. Virtue. This word we hear a lot about, but it's the way in which we achieve this holiness, this uniting in heart with Christ. The life of virtue, though, is difficult. Virtue comes from its Latin root virtus, which translated literally means strength. Virtue is strength to overcome weakness. But the virtue we receive from God, the grace from God in virtue, is not perfect, because another etymological root found in the word virtue is vir, which is the word for man. Virtue, by definition, the strength from God, is given to man to do good. But mankind, because of original sin, is imperfect, and we don't always use the gifts that we've been given to the best of their ability. We don't always use the grace that God gives us appropriately. St. Thomas tells us that grace builds on our nature. Virtue, this strength from God, is a grace to fight against sin and temptation, but our nature, our humanity, is prone to sin. Our nature is not totally deprived, like Martin Luther would say, but it is a daily struggle to overcome our desires for what is not good for us. But there's another part of the definition of virtue that's very important. Virtue is a habit. It has to be exercised. It has to be done over and over and over. Now, I remember when I was in high school, I can remember that far back, and I had to take a keyboarding class. Basically, it's where we learned how to type. I hated that class. I was so bad at it. Now, I was a nerd in high school, if you could imagine such a thing. I could do math and science and get all A's in the important stuff, but this was a complete waste of time. I just couldn't do typing. It was frustrating. By the end of the year, however, after much frustration and complaining, I got pretty proficient, but by no means was the fastest or the best in my class. And I thought, great, now I never have to use this skill again. Well, the internet came onto the scene, and personal computers became cheap, and by the time I graduated high school, everything was typed, researched, or done on a computer in a matter of just a few years. An irony of ironies, when I went to college, I got a job on campus in my department computer lab. I began to take for granted the fact that I could type. Basically learned another language. I remember, especially in seminary, when people never learned how to type and had to chicken peck and type 10-page papers, and just how long and frustratingly tedious this was for them, or to watch them to try to take notes in class. But the habit was in me. I'd already built the habit. Now I can type without even thinking about it. In fact, my fingers sometimes go so fast that my brain seems not to be able to catch up. And I have to find myself pausing so that my brain can catch up to what I'm typing. I've even commented several times that the best two classes I ever took in school were keyboarding and my high school English class. This is a guy who went and studied engineering. I can't imagine my life without them, even though I absolutely hated both of them at the time. This is kind of how virtue works. It's difficult. It would be so much easier to just throw in the towel and give up. Oh, and I did that in band after I gave up the trombone in a week. Or we can stick it out and persevere and obtain a habit that serves us for the rest of our life. Now, virtues are much more important than typing or English writing skills. But the similarity is they require a lot of effort, a lot of work, and sometimes some great friends to pull you through. St. Paul says that Jesus is our encouragement. And indeed, he is our greatest encouragement. He is the reason, he is the goal to which we set our sights. But he also created us as social beings, created us for each other, and created us for each other's good, each other's benefit. So we not only have each other as a resource, but also as an obligation to see that we are helping each other out of that love we are supposed to have for our neighbor and to build up virtue. But sometimes we mess it up. Sometimes we aren't virtuous or we lead others away from virtue. And I hate to break it to you, but it will happen. But our mark as Christians, our salvation is not left in our mistakes unless we leave it there. Our salvation, as our reading tells us, depends on whether or not we are willing to get back up, to dust ourselves off, and to try again and give God's grace another chance. And yeah, sometimes we might fall 100 times before we get it right. You know what? I still make typos when I type. But the important thing is we don't stop trying. We pick our shovels up, we get out into the vineyard, and we get to work. We can't just say, oh yeah, I'm all in, and not do anything about it, like the second brother. We have to put in the sweat and be willing to get dirty. As Christ says, the tax collectors and prostitutes will be getting into heaven long before us. Not because they're tax collectors and prostitutes. Don't get any ideas. It's because they turned away from that life and gave virtue a shot. They said yes when they had previously been saying no. Loving God and loving neighbor is not about being perfect in our love, but it's a willingness to keep trying to do better. Today, October 1st, is the feast day of Saint Therese of Lisieux. She is one of the most famous and beloved saints of all time. She gives us a simple recipe for virtue, and she calls it the little way. She stresses the importance of building virtue one step at a time, one small deed at a time, growing into the grace that God gives us, rather than trying to take it all on at once and feeling like a miserable failure. Kind of like a weightlifter, slowly stepping up to that goal weight. Then, so that we might intentionally do the little things every single day to the everyday people in our lives and sanctify every day in these opportunities and thus sanctify our whole life. Sometimes it's for her was giving a heartwarming smile to a nun who treated her horribly or said mean things about her behind her back. Sometimes it was passing up the dessert that she really liked the most. Not because she had to, but she did it because she wanted to, with the intention of giving it to God, just as He gave His Son for us. But she stresses nothing excessive, but always intentional, always seeking to love God and love your neighbor more and more. And if you do these things every day, she was convinced that at the end of her life and at the end of ours, if we too could accomplish it, that we would go straight to God with empty hands, because we wouldn't be holding on to things of this world, but we would go to Him with a full heart, because all was accomplished in union with Him. Hearts united. Virtue is hard, but the reward is great. Because the reason we act is for love, for the other person, for God and for neighbor. And since God is love in all its forms, it is He who we find waiting for us at the end of our hard day's labor in the vineyard. It is He who welcomes us as His good and faithful servant, both now and forever in His heavenly kingdom.